for the Church, Imre Lakatos, or Paul Feyerabend. I usually try to keep my posts more or less relevant to a fairly wide audience, and at first glance, this one certainly seems to be nothing of the kind. However, I would contend that while this certainly has much more to say to someone who's familiar with the two thinkers in question, the general audience might still be interested in how the issues seem to play out. Not long ago, I went to hear an academic paper about the role of the community in Christian epistemology. That is to say, the paper was about how the church community influences and plays a role in what we know and how we know it. In order to draw this out, the presenter, from time to time, compared the theological community to the scientific community. What may be surprising to some, but far less so to others, is that the theological community did not come off looking very good in this comparison. Scientists, it was claimed, though never argued for, are rigorous and disciplined in their work, while Christians are noticeably less so. It should be noted that at this point, the community of professional research scientists was being compared not with theologians committed to their field, but lay people, many of whom, for very good reasons, have neither the time nor the inclination to gain knowledge at that level. Even if we were to restrict the comparison to research scientists and professional theologians, it is undeniable that, compared to the scientists, the theologians look incredibly fragmented. It seems that they have nothing better to do than to squabble with each other about issues that matter only to themselves, and it doesn't seem like we, for I am one of them, are making much progress. Clearly this presenter had a lot to say, and much of it was very good. It was not entirely above critique, though. My secondary area of specialty is the philosophy of science. Because of this, I was able to recognize that the presenter's discussion of the scientific community and the nature of science was not something that was self-evident or obvious to all. Indeed, it represented a very particular philosophical tradition, finding one of its more classical expressions in the thought of Imre Lakatos. I pointed this out, and noting that not all philosophers of science were Lakatosian, I asked how the discussion might look different with a different model of science, such as that of Paul Feyerabend. The response was somewhat less than I had hoped for. I was told that Feyerabend had made no real contribution to the philosophy of science, that he believed crazy things, and that if anyone were to come to the discussion taking people like Feyerabend seriously, there could simply be no real discussion, for Feyerabend denies basic scientific convictions, like science is necessarily progressive, in that it always gains knowledge. He concluded by claiming that even if Feyerabend has something to contribute to the philosophy of science, which he doubts, there is certainly no reason why the Church should find him alluring. Now, this was troubling to me for several reasons. At the most basic level, it's because I find myself in significant sympathy with Feyerabend's position, especially when compared to that of Lakatos. Beyond that, I was troubled by his description, though one might say caricature, of Feyerabend's thought. I say caricature, but I must have some grace on this issue, since Feyerabend might just be the most misrepresented thinker of the last 50 years or so. Suffice it to say that Feyerabend does not think that science makes no progress, only that, unless you define progress as getting better at answering questions that scientists, though perhaps nobody else, are interested in asking, then you cannot say that science makes progress without also acknowledging that there's also a certain degree of regress, of forgetting old knowledge and old ways of knowing in the misleading assumption that scientific knowledge is the only knowledge worth having. The presenter's description was so misleading that one is pressed to conclude either that he has radically misunderstood Feyerabend's work, or else he's not actually read it. My primary concern at this point is to contest the presenter's claim that the Church has nothing to gain from Feyerabend as opposed to Lakatos. Not only that, I believe that Feyerabend might be one of the very few philosophers of science who actually articulate some issues in the philosophy of science in a way that it would seem the Christian is compelled to express them, precisely because of their Christian convictions. But first, a summary of the relevant points in the thought of the two philosophers. There are many reasons why Lakatos would seem, at first, to be particularly attractive to Christians. He's broken out of what might seem to many Christians as the somewhat stifling attitude attributed to Karl Popper, though Lakatos denies this, that every statement we make ought to be strictly falsifiable if it is to be scientific or even knowledge, properly so called. However, he's also abandoned the goal of knowing absolute truth as the goal of scientific inquiry. In its place, he suggests that we should not judge a theory with whether or not it could be said to be falsified, since he agrees that oftentimes many scientists continue to subscribe to a theory which has, from one point of view, been falsified because it is still making progress in the sense that it's answering questions raised by scientists at the time. For Lakatos, then, what really matters is not truth or falsity, but intellectual virtue and reasonableness or rationality. He argues that we can never know at any point in time whether we are justified in holding or abandoning a particular theory, but that we should make those decisions based on whether our theories generate what he calls a progressive or degenerating problem shift. What this means is that since we cannot, in general, decide based on the empirical evidence whether we should abandon a theory or hard core of scientific convictions, we must do what we do because we have good reasons for doing so. If the theory creates a progressive problem shift, our reason may be nothing more than that we feel like we're making progress. If we feel that the problem shift is stagnating or degenerating, we must give that as a reason that we abandon it for one of its rivals. On this model, then, science is not really about coming to know the world around us at all. That might be a nice side effect, but the real goal is being intellectually virtuous, of being able to give reasons for why we do everything. One of the big problems that Lakatos' view has is that while he wants to push the question of whether we're being rational back from the level of individual theories to the level of series of theories, he gives no real criteria as to how we can tell when we are being rational there either, with the possible exception that subsequent generations can either praise us for making the right choice or condemn us for making the wrong one. This may or may not save the rationality of science as a whole, but it does nothing to preserve the rationality of individual scientists or even schools of scientists. This is, in reality, a brilliant move, for it tucks scientists safely behind a shield which always says, "You can't judge me until a later generation." The great tradition of the need for science to be falsifiable, which Lakatos saw himself as attempting to uphold and defend, ends up being nothing more than a possible rule by which science can be seen to progress at the level of making a generally progressive advance measured in centuries, not smaller units of time. By contrast, Feyerabend seems to be unfooled by the attempt to say that while other disciplines are allegedly to be held to a fairly rigorous standard of falsification, and that whether a particular field or discipline should be considered worthy of study is to be judged from the point of view of this kind of philosophy of science, science itself can appeal to history for its vindication. He's often described as an anarchist because he wrote a book whose central message, so it is said, is that when it comes to knowledge, anything goes. This, of course, is not the message of his book, and he says so with some frequency. It is not that, when it comes to knowledge, anything goes, but that, if we have to have a rule for everything, and that we can only defend our actions if we are behaving in accordance with a rule that we decided ahead of time to follow, then the only rule that we can claim to consistently follow is a rule that says anything goes. He not only alleges this point, but brings quite a lot of historical evidence to bear on it. Additionally, it must be noted that Feyerabend, for much of his publishing career, claims to be a realist. This either comes as a surprise to many people, who consider him to be the most strident of the anti-realists, or else it strikes them as a piece of his characteristic irony in writing. Incidentally, the people who are inclined to claim that Feyerabend is being ironic when he claims to be a realist are often precisely the people who are disinclined to think he's being ironic in other places, even when he claims quite boldly, both in the preface to that work and in replies to the reviews of that work, that he was. Even with only this much reflection, we might find a fruitful answer to the question as to whether Lakatos or Feyerabend is more congenial to Christian faith. One side says that at the end of the day, rules are the backbone of life, that we can never really know truth, and so we should just cling to the rules of our own invention, because then at least we can say, I wasn't arbitrary, I followed a set of rules. The other side says that reality doesn't submit to our rules. Our rules can be helpful up to a point, but once they move past that point, they're no longer helpful. Indeed, they tend at that point to distort reality and make it harder to see what really is the case. Rather than cling to rules or searching for ways to make it clear that we are right and others are wrong, we should be focused on reality and letting it be what it is in itself and not what we have tried to force it to be. It's clear that Feyerabend's philosophy could rather easily be put to work in defense of a kind of pluralism or relativism that many Christians would find distasteful. But is that the only way it can be used? Someone important once made a pretty sharp critique of groups of people who are more dedicated to their rules and traditions than they are to God, that you can have lots of good reasons for doing what you do and yet still be completely wrong. That same rather important person also said that even the most clear and helpful rules in all of history need to be challenged. His attack on defining good or virtuous behavior in terms of rules or the law is so famous as to be brought into the service of people who want to have no constraints on their lives in any way. If the fact that Jesus can be interpreted as a kind of relativist, especially as compared with the Pharisees, and yet not be made unhelpful for the church, surely Feyerabend's thought should not be dismissed because it doesn't fit in with the rules we think it should have. It might just be that the Feyerabendian critique of the philosophy of science might have a valuable role to play in reminding the church that our obedience is not, in the end, to a set of rules, but to the living Christ who shatters every theoretical system upon which he falls, and upon whom every theoretical system which is put on him is broken.